You ready?
Hunter Boberg says I'll show up then. That's recording, by the way, so just keep, you start whenever.
All right, so now we'll talk about how to start a Bargue drawing. The easiest way I can think of to break down the elements of drawing is to say that we can break them down into three major steps and 6 or 7 elements. The first step we think about, I think I just broke your lead, sorry.
It's all right. Wonder where that came from.
We think about placement, proportion, and gesture. Initially, we may talk about placement, proportion as relative size, and gesture as relative angles. The second stage of development is shape, and the third stage is value and edge, and we may also talk about form. Another thing that we want to think about throughout the drawing is concept of line economy, getting the most information out of the least, with the least amount of effort. And then one thing we always talk about forever, from the first day through the rest of your time at the academy, is the concept of the whole. And you can see on every board in here, this is all written down the same way. So initially, we don't want to start thinking about shape first, because if we put this angle next to this angle and this angle next to this angle, and they're all properly placed, we get a correct proportion, and a shape emerges without actually thinking about the shape. And then we can come in, once we've got our overall proportion and gesture, and start to refine the shape. So the finer elements of that shape may be that this curves out or whatever. There's going to inevitably be ways to refine into those shapes. But we want to make sure the shapes are already pretty well developed based on the concepts of proportion and gesture before we switch our mind into thinking about the shapes individually. Value and edge and form have a lot to do with finishing. And so we don't necessarily want to start thinking about finishing early on. We want to give ourselves a solid foundation to finish into. So initially when we start this, we start with what's called the envelope. And the envelope is basically putting very few lines around the entirety of the drawing to envelop the overall mass. So we would start up here at the top, and we would put one line through there. Every drawing is a little different, but in this case, there's one line, then from there out to the end of the toe, 2 lines, 3, 4 to the base, then that basically runs right along the bottom, 5, and 6. I might even get a 7th in there, from there to there, and then change angles a little bit to there. So what that ends up looking like, roughly, if I have plumb line, top and bottom line, is that starts to the right of the plumb line, comes out about that angle, comes out there, down through there, down to the base, up through there, and back up there. So that's what the envelope is going to end up looking like. The reality is that this doesn't necessarily resemble this all that much. It looks like a big block of marble, if you want to think about it that way. So ideally, we would get pretty close in this stage to an accurate portrayal of the proportion. But in order to check ourselves, we take a half step into the next stage of development to check the previous step. So I would want to, and this is all before measuring, I really want to push my eyes as much as possible, before I take any measurements to really force myself to see this thing as accurate as I can. From here, I would carve down through there, over, down, and then back to the toes. Here, I think there's not a whole lot extra that needs to be done here. I might come up here and then here, and may carve in slightly there too. And I haven't added that much information. So in terms of line economy, I've only added maybe 6 lines, but I'm getting a lot more information relative to the original block that I once had. This resembles the original far more than the block did. That's going to allow me to make judgments on the placement of these angles relative to each other, relative also to the plumb line and the top and bottom line, much more accurately than this overall block would. So at this stage, I still haven't taken any measurements. And what I would do then is step away from the drawing. This physical separation from the drawing allows this to kind of push itself into a thumbnail type size. The closer I am to the surface, the less of the whole I can take in. So that can be problematic. I think it was Da Vinci said, in order to take in the entirety of a subject at once, you have to be 3 times the height of the subject away from the subject. So in this case, it's not that tall. So if I step back 4 or 5 feet, I'm going to be able to glance at this thing and judge it a lot more readily than if I'm always constantly stuck up here at arm's length. So what I want to do once I get to this place is step back and really judge the thing back and forth as well and accurately as I can, and then make adjustments. If this happens to be, let's say I put this line out here, that's obviously too wide for the placement of that angle, right? So if I step back and see that, then I can make an adjustment here to that angle and start to refine the drawing or these basic elements of placement and gesture. If I step back and the angle is completely off, I can make that adjustment. So I want to push that stage of the drawing as much as possible, within reason, obviously. I don't want to spend 3 weeks trying to get this just with my eye, but I'd like to make it as accurate as possible before I take any measurements. So when you put these lines down, it's the same thing as the top-bottom plumb line. You want to make sure you're laying it just on the top of the page so that you can see I erased those without any evidence that they were there. If you need to go over a line several times in order to get it straight, that's okay. I would just advise that you come back immediately and clean that line up. Because on a drawing this small, if I have a line that's sketchy like that, it's okay to be sketchy, but if I leave it like that, am I judging on this side of the line or this side of the line? Because that's a huge shift in the overall proportion of a drawing that's this small. So go ahead and sketch the line down there, but then come back and clean that line up so that you're left with a cleaner indication of what you're actually trying to, the statement you're trying to make. From there, what I would do is, once I feel like I'm pretty close with these measurements, then with the lay-in, what I would do is actually measure a few things. I would measure, let's say in this case, of course every drawing is unique to itself, but from the plumb line, I might measure the overall distance to the outside of the toe and then come over and see that. Let's say I put my end of the toe here. That's the placement. And I really think that's correct. I'm going to measure this then. Come over here and realize, oh, it's not there. It's much further in. It's more like that. I'll be a little disappointed that I saw that inaccurately, but that is good, because the point is, once I move it to something that's more correct, that's the thing that starts to change those meters in my brain that right now aren't very accurate, and telling me what accurate is. It's going to help me develop a new sensitivity towards a higher level of accuracy. So when I move that in, it should feel more correct. And I'm going to ask myself, why did I see it way out there initially? And I'm going to start to challenge those, my thoughts of what I thought accurate was, and make them a little bit more perfect. So every time I measure, that becomes a new standard. So now instead of just judging off the top, bottom, and plumb line, now I know that the overall width is correct as well once I make that shift. I can measure also for this. I can measure for, say, the height from the top down. I can measure for the placement of that. I would probably take 3 or 4 of those measurements and then adjust the entire drawing to that. Then I'd go a little bit further and start to define a little bit more in the drawing. Again, just with my eye and basing it off of all of these measurements, all of those absolutes that I put on the page, and try to take the drawing a little bit further. And then I would step back and assess it again, try to adjust it as best I can. When I thought I was really correct, I would take 2 or 3 more measurements. And that sort of is the process by which we go through the entirety of the drawing. After the initial lay-in, and once I've developed this a little bit, what I'm going to try to do is come on the inside of the drawing. I don't want to necessarily wait until I have a perfectly rendered contour in order to come on the inside, because the masses on the inside are going to justify the masses on the outside. Again, you're taking a half step forward in adding the information on the interior to justify the information in the previous step, which is the contour. So that's when I would start to separate light from dark. The Bargue drawings are really brilliantly designed in these early stages. There's very little variation between light and shadow. There's almost no halftone in the early drawings. There's a little bit of halftone here and here, maybe a little bit there and up in here. But overall, if you squint, all you see is a big light mass and a large dark mass. And that's the way you want to think. So these halftones I'm going to eliminate. You have to ask yourself, is it light or is it dark? There's a scale in value. And at some point you have to separate, let's say a 9-point scale. At some point you have to say, here's the cutoff right there. And everything down here is shadow, and everything above that is light. So even the darkest light is still in the light family, and even the lightest dark is still in the dark family. So if the rule is, in value, that the darkest light can never be as dark as the lightest dark, and the lightest dark can never be as light as the darkest light. Does that make sense? You can slow that down and replay it if you need to. But these two can never mix, otherwise your overall sense of light is going to be corrupted. So at some point you have to make that decision. When you get into working from life where light is a lot more soft and subtle, especially if you're working from natural light, the value shifts are far more subtle. You really have to have a highly developed sensitivity for how to separate those two families. When you're working on, say, a copy like this, there's far more subtle variation in those values. And so this is why this would be a more advanced drawing, because you really need to understand how to separate those before you start tackling these. Bargue has done it for us in simplifying them down to 2 or 3 basic values. So when you initially start to lay this in, you're going to be very simple and blocky, just like you were initially with the contour. And you're going to use mostly straights, all straights, I would say, and just start to indicate the basic angle of these things, which will develop into shapes. With the toes, that's a little bit more specific. I might just initially suggest the angle here, the angle that connects all of the top of the toes, and the angle here, which will at least give you the placement for and how these things tie together. It's very blocky and simple, and allows you to step back and just check those major angles, whether or not the separation of these two masses is working proportionally before you start thinking about refining any of these shapes. Once that's done, I'm taking you through a few stages in advance. Once that's done, what you'll do is you'll very lightly separate. What you have now is an outline of a dark mass and an outline of a light mass. But this doesn't necessarily resemble this completely accurately because you have a mass and a mass here instead of an outline against an outline. So what you'll want to do when you feel confident that the proportion is pretty good here is you will mask all of your darks in. Very lightly. Let's use this since it's already a little bit further. If I were to mask this in, I would very lightly mask the entirety of that value in. I'm doing it a little bit faster here, but you want to be as flat as possible. And then you have then an outline of a mass against, an actual mass of dark and an actual mass of light. That makes it much easier to judge. And you can see that in this drawing here. A flatter mass against a flatter mass. So that's 2 or 3 stages of the development of a Bargue drawing, and that should be at least enough to get you started.